All right, so welcome back to 1750 to 1914. This will be part two, and I'll be talking about revolutions. This is going to be, buckle up, because this one is going to be kind of a long one, but I'll be splitting revolutions into two parts. So, uh, oh boy, there's just going to be parts within parts within parts. It'll be like Dune. Uh, so, so for revolutions, you guys might be thinking of things like the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. But there are a lot of differences between these different kinds of revolutions, and so personally, I don't think that the American Revolution really counts as a revolution. It's to me, it's just more of like a war of independence, which it is. But here's like more of what I like my rationale behind this. So there are revolutions in a lot of places. So here are the political revolutions. So we have the Wars of Independence. So like that is the American Revolution, the fall of the Spanish Empire. So that's a lot of different wars of independence over there. And then I think you could also stick the American Civil War into this. Only in this case, the South doesn't get its independence. Then we have things like social revolutions. So that'd be like the French Revolution, the most famous one. But then there are actually like two more French revolutions, and then even more failed French revolutions. There's also the Russian revolutions, which are going to be happening at there's going to be one in 1905, and then there will be another one in 1917, which is out of the scope of this week. There's national unifications where you take countries that were actually just a bunch of different like states that weren't united, and then you turn them all into one nation. And I'll be defining what exactly a nation is later when we get to them. Um, so so the first group that we're going to be talking about are the American Wars of Independence. And when I say American, I don't mean like United States American, but I mean um, like North Americans and South Americans, the people who live in the Americas, which includes, the US, but also like Latin America or Spanish America. So I'm not going to go into each one of these revolutions individually because that would take forever. But here's some like general ideas for how exactly these wars of independence tend to play out. So usually it's the ruling class in these colonies that rise up against colonial empires. So this would be if you want to take the American Revolution, it would be people like George Washington, who was the richest man in in the colonies, and so they're the people who like lead these wars of independence, and who um, actually like decide to leave, but then they're fought mainly by poor people, and they're usually conscripted people. And conscription is when you force people to fight, like where like you just be minding your own business, but then a group of soldiers come by and they hand you a gun and tell you that you're now fighting for them. And so the reason why it's usually fought by poor people is not only because there's more poor people than rich people, but also because rich people were usually able to get out of conscription, while poor people weren't. There's also these early revolutionary armies also tended to be made up of minorities. So, like in the U.S., there's a large number of Irish soldiers fighting in both the American Revolution and then also the American Civil War. Uh, and you can also see like this in the case of the American Civil War, which is, I guess I'm going to call it a war of independence now, even though I'm not including it in this timeline, where that whole war was fought because the landowners in the South wanted to keep their slaves. And most people in the South didn't have slaves, but the whole economy revolved around it. And so the landowners managed to get lots of, poor like white people to go fight for them. And even though it didn't really benefit them that much. Also, these wars of independence are also influenced by the Enlightenment, the idea that the government, if it fails to represent the people, then the people should overthrow it. But here's the issue: who exactly are the people? Because today we'd think of the people as in, you know, as including everybody who lives in a country or in a society. But to the colonial elites who are, making, say, their declarations of independence or making their constitutions, the people is a very narrow idea, group, because these landowners who are leading these revolutions, they want the revolutions to benefit them. And so they are going to be rich white landowners. And that's going to be in the case for both the American Revolution and for revolutions all across South America. Um, like like the idea of we the people is kind of a myth because it's excluding black slaves, women, poor white people, and Native Americans in both North and South. So, what is actually changing here? And what's mainly changing is that you just boot out the Spaniards or the British, and then you replace the British and the Spaniards with people who were already kind of in charge. So not exactly that much changes, like socially wise. Just this one class of colonial landowners just gets it just gets like formal political power, which helps them out. But for example, after like the American Revolution, there's a lot of issues in the United States from all these poor veterans who they went to war. During the war, they lost their land and possibly like farms, everything they owned, and then after the war, they don't get anything out of it because the revolution is meant to benefit a very small section of society. The U.S. government did distribute land, but it wasn't enough for everybody who fought in the wars. So this is probably going to sound very similar to those kids who are taking the Rome class. So then there's the social revolutions, which I consider to be like real revolutions. And these ones start out led by rich people, and these are typically led by the educated people, so like lawyers. But then this time they're against nobles, as in like old blood, things like that. Although a lot of nobles actually do end up like leading these early revolutions. But as these revolutions continue, they tend to expand to the poor, and mainly poor city people, because the city people are close to the center of power. And that's like the real big difference behind the social revolutions and the wars of independence. Because in the social revolutions, the poor have a very big voice. And the reason why the poor get involved is usually a result of crop failure. Crop failure is something that we've visited many times in the fall of major governments. And, like, for example, before the French Revolution, there's crop failures all across France. And during, the Russian revolutions, there's famine and things like that. And there's also the whole reason why this is important, though, is because all these city people rely on food from the countryside to support them. So then when there's no food, they're going to blame the government, regardless of like how legitimate that is, especially if the government mismanages the food. Because they're going to be seeing all these like rich nobles with all this food while they're starving on the streets, and they're going to be very angry about that. And so these social revolutions tend to overthrow regimes that do badly at managing crises like crop failures. And these regimes or these governments that are being overthrown tend to be old and kind of a legal mess. But also a lot of these revolutions get crushed, like very, very brutally by the army or things like that. So, I mean, I guess speaking of revolutions being crushed, there you have like a reference to Les Mis. But so these revolutions tend to involve way more social change, and it's actually kind of hectic because there's going to be a lot of infighting between different classes. What they tend to do is they replace the old noble classes with merchants and city classes, as well as landowners, but landowners are less important than they are in the American Revolution. or in the American revolutions. Um, there's also the expansion of voting rights. And usually this is kind of temporary, where, it's like in the case of the French Revolution, there's different stages of expanding voting rights. There's like points where you're only giving voting rights to people who are rich and own land. Then you give voting rights to the urban poor. Then you give voting rights to all men, regardless of it, of like their um, all men, regardless of their wealth. And then you give voting rights to women, who usually come last. And every time voting rights do get given to women during these revolutions, they get taken away pretty quickly because the governments usually collapse. So that's what I do want to talk about, because this is Olympe de Gouges. She lived during the French Revolution, and she was really like very intelligent, and she advocated for the rights of women. She wrote this thing called the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen, like pretty much right after the revolutionaries made this thing called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Male Citizen. So, she was really instrumental in helping expand rights for women. But then what happens though is the revolution starts collapsing on itself. Uh, yeah, I've heard it referred to as the revolution is eating its own children. Not literally, but in a reference to, like, Kronos, or in that old Greek myth. But in this case, the political party that Olympe de Gouges supports falls out of favor. And they fall out of favor hard, where they get taken out by this other group led by this guy named Maximilien Robespierre. And Robespierre has this whole political party, including Olympe de Gouges, guillotined, as in, they get their heads chopped off. And so, yeah, revolutions are not exactly like fun things to live through, because they tend to be like chock full of infighting. And the leader of the political party that Olympe de Gouges supported was this guy named Georges Danton. And Danton is the guy in our password, but more importantly, like when the revolution started, he was a hardcore radical. He was someone on the very, very like fringe of the revolution. But then 2 years into the revolution, he started getting seen as like a mainstream leader. And then a year after that, he actually started getting seen as someone who opposed the revolution. And during this entire time, his beliefs didn't change. So, because things just move so fast in these revolutions, and so that leads to a lot of infighting, and leads to what happens to Danton and Olympe de Gouges. So the important things for like why we should care about revolutions, though, is they establish three main things. So the first one of those things are nation states. We're going to be talking about this in the next slide, but it's the idea that, all right, we just overthrew the government and we got rid of the king. And so now what's holding us together? It's not the king anymore. It's the fact that we're all French, or that we're all Haitian, or that we're all, I guess, excuse me, or eventually that we're all Russian. And not only that, too, is that the armies of the revolutions tend to be made up of the entire population, at least the social revolutions. And so all these massive, massive armies, they're bigger than anything we've seen before in human history, are bringing people from all over the country together, and they fight together. And so that's kind of creating national identities, which is something that we have today, and that seems kind of just normal to us. There's also personal dignity, the idea that we're not just peasants anymore. We're not just faceless things to be traded around. We've overthrown the government. We should be listened to. This is something that you can't really put in numbers, but it is a very important social shift, because revolution it just makes everyone more interested in politics. Then the third thing that I want to talk about is that it leads to the modern society where, today we don't have people who are in charge because they come from some distinguished bloodline. We have people in charge mainly because they're rich. And it's money over blood, which is something that revolutions really bring to the table for us. So this is kind of definitive for how modern societies tend to work. And so, just to talk about nationalism, I kind of did like talk about how nationalism kind of starts, but just as to like, it might be weird to think of like forming a national identity. That seems a bit abstract. So just the idea is before the revolutions and before like national reunifications, you'd have people who'd speak some like the same language, but then they'd be separated into different states. So let's take Italy, or the Italian states, as it should be better called, in 1815. You have Sardinia, Piedmont, one kingdom. You have Lombardy, another kingdom. You have Venetia, another kingdom. You have Parma, another kingdom. You have Tuscany. You have the Papal States. You have the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. All of them in Italy. So you might be thinking, oh, like, and these are all Italians, but they don't think of themselves as Italians. But then in 1871, you get the actual Kingdom of Italy, where they unify into one Italian nation. Also in 1864, you can see the German, or the various German states, divided into this pretty horrible mess of different tiny states. And there again, they are all German speaking, but they don't think of themselves as Germans, at least until they get unified together in the German Empire in 1871. Same time as Italy, for something I'm not getting into, but it is for the same reason. So since to prevent this video from going way too long, I'm going to end it there. Next time we're going to be talking about the Industrial Revolution, one of the other great revolutions of this period. It's both it's political, economic, and social. So, bye. See you very soon.